This is What, Why, How, and I'm going a little bit crazy. And it's not because I spend most of my free time trying to debunk random communists or fascists, it's because instead I spend way too much of my free time with a gigantic election spreadsheet. And if you watched a couple videos ago that I made, this shouldn't be a surprise to you, but what should be a surprise, hopefully a pleasant surprise, is that I've updated this spreadsheet to be much more detailed, accurate, and creative. There's a bunch more stuff in this, and I want to use this spreadsheet now to show you a couple different alternate history timelines. And by the way, you can get this spreadsheet yourself on patreon.com/whatwhyhow for just $1 a month to support the channel. Okay, so here is timeline number 1, and we can see in the bottom left over here that the winner of the 2024 presidential election was Chris Christie, who is a moderate in this timeline and the leader of the Agrarian Party, which swept the western states, including California, some of New England, and some of the mid-Atlantic too. He's rivaled by the Republicans, which are a conservative party, and then there is the Patriot Party, which is a more liberal party, and they received around 10% of the Electoral College votes and around 5% of the popular votes. So we can see that in this timeline, American politics has 3 major parties and, maybe a 4th minor one. And over here, we can see how we could categorize this timeline as a whole. So not just the 2024 presidential election, but the entire timeline. We can see that there was 1 civil war and 2 expansions. So that would be acquiring Texas, and then invading northwestern Mexico and acquiring those states a while ago. We can see the most current president for our timeline right now in 2026 is Chris Christie. The best one was William Taft, who won a major war back in the 1910s or maybe 1920s. The worst one was George Dewey, who suffered a civil war. The most radical president was James Birney, who was a progressive in this time period, so perhaps a radical abolitionist, and the longest-serving president was DeWitt Clinton, who served for 12 years in the early 1800s. But that's not just all that this spreadsheet has. It also has, look at this, a nice graph where you could see the history of the parties. Let me zoom out for a second, and we could see that for much of the early part of American history, it was the Republicans, the Jeffersonian Republicans, J for Jeffersonian, versus the Federalists. Then, around the 1870s, the 2 parties collapsed. There was a major third party win. Then we had the American Party versus the Democrats and the Agrarians for a while. Then the Patriots popped in, and it was the Patriots versus the Agrarians versus the Populists. And then the Republicans popped up too. And that is the current status quo in American politics. And we can also see this in the congressional breakdown of parties. But, perhaps more interestingly, you can see the ideological balance of parties. So we can see in this chaotic period of American history, the parties were zooming back and forth all over the place, depending on their response to the major political questions of the day. But since the early 1900s, the parties have stabilized, so that, more or less, they're all centrist parties. Nothing too radical except for the Republicans in this time period. I don't know what happened over there. Maybe some radical leader took charge. But that's not all we have. We have additional election maps. We've got the 2064 presidential election, which is the future, of course. We got the 2024 presidential election, which you saw up there. We got 1976, where Jimmy Carter won in a landslide, it looks like. Then we have 1928, when Herbert Hoover won in a landslide. In 1880, James A. Garfield led the Union Party to a landslide victory against the American Party, which seems to have been popular in the South. And interestingly, they didn't have much of these states yet because, of course, they hadn't acquired them yet. Then in 1832, we have the Federalists and the Republicans. But that's not all we have. We also have detailed history. So we have each president, how long they served, what their party was, how much they won by, how much their congressional allies won by, and then we can see how they performed. So, for example, we can see DeWitt Clinton served 3 terms. He won a major war in his first term. He suffered a scandal in his second term, and his third term was pretty insignificant. But the Federalists kept control until the 1840 presidential election, when James Birney won on a radical progressive platform, probably in response to, well, it looks like the rising scandal of slavery. So I have a stability calculator over here, which calculates how stable America is. And there's certain time periods when the country becomes more unstable, especially in the middle of the 1800s when slavery really became a controversial issue in real life and in this timeline as well. And that drives the two parties to explode apart over here. Well, actually, here's an interesting thing that happened. Looks like James Birney made some major progress in stabilizing the country. Then we have Winfield Scott also stabilizing the country a little bit. That's stability, of course. That's not E-Day approval. But then it looks like the two parties collapsed. I wonder what happened. Well, we can scroll over here and we can see that parties... I wonder what happened. I think it's because, see, this is what happened. The Federalists became too powerful, so the Republicans got wiped out, the Federalists became too powerful, and they split apart into two major parties. Let's see if we can see what the parties were. So here is all the details. Now, of course, if you watched the last video, you know what all these details were, but let me just explain them before everyone gets confused. So this is the approval for the political party. This is not how much votes they get. This is not how much support they get in the Electoral College. This is their approval overall. So, for example, in the 1868 presidential election, everybody loves the Federalists, and they don't really care very much about the Jeffersonian Republicans, right? But then by 1872, the Federalists have split apart into two rival factions. It looks like the most major one is the Democrats, and then the third party. So maybe a radical abolitionist party, maybe some other sort of third party that would appear in the late 1800s. But then the Democrats become a lasting party for a couple election cycles before they too die away. Now let's check over here why the Democrats died. Well, it looks like President Benjamin Harrison had a recession, and then President William McKinley oversaw the country during a period of chaos. And that's probably because they failed to correct some sort of fundamental issue in America. And these issues just add up over time. So, for example, here's a major war loss, a recession, a scandal, a recession, chaos, and then a civil war. And that is the civil war that we saw in the beginning that the spreadsheet registered. But then afterwards, we have the Patriot Party pop up as a conservative to moderate party, the Agrarians as a moderate to conservative party, and the Populists as a moderate to liberal party. And then over time, the parties swap back and forth, they compete against each other. And look, 2020, we have, where is that? 2021, starting in 2021, we have Chris Christie. He wins re-election in 2024, but then he is defeated, his party's defeated in 2028 by Pete Buttigieg, who is the leader of the Liberal Republican Party. So we can see there's a whole bunch of detail. You can even see the party ideologies over here, how they switch over time. Scrolling, here they are. So we can see the Jeffersonian Republicans stay as a liberal Jeffersonian party. Federalists stay as a conservative party before they split apart. Democrats are more liberal. So I guess the liberals of the Federalists, however many there were, went over here to the Democrats. And then the conservatives went to the Americans over time. And then over here we can see the Agrarian Party starts off as progressive. So this would be like a farmer labor party. But then they became very conservative. But then they stayed in the middle, became more liberal. And a similar story played out with the liberal Republicans, who might just be the Republicans. But they started off as a liberal party, then they became conservative in the 90s, 2000s looks like, and now they're centrist again. And this tends to happen when there are three major parties. They tend to coalesce around the center for whatever reason they prioritize. Now, if you watched the last video, you'd know that they seek out where the voters are. So if they perform poorly in an election, they rebalance. There's also a random factor too, as parties compete theoretically between maybe a more liberal candidate and a more conservative candidate. But when there are three parties, for whatever reason, they coalesce around the center. I'm not sure why that is. It probably makes sense in the calculations, but I'm not sure why exactly. But that's not all this graph has. So you can see that we track over here when new states join. So for example, if we ever conquer Quebec, this gets marked in the chart. This did not have it in this timeline, but we can also see every single state's voting record here. So we can see in this period, it's the Federalists versus the Republicans. Then there's a chaos in the middle over that Civil War period, if you remember. Then we have the Agrarians, the Republicans, and the Patriots. Those are the three major parties of the modern period. And unlike in real life, does this timeline have anything weird? No, there's no Cuba, there's no Puerto Rico, there's no Canada, there's no Sonora or Chihuahua. It's just like real life where we have Texas and then California and the other western states. So that's just one timeline. And if you have access to this spreadsheet, you can just endlessly refresh it and generate new timelines from scratch with all the conditions and all the weird things that could happen. So for example, if I refresh this page, we have a new timeline here. So in this timeline, we have President Joe Manchin, who is the leader of the Whig Party, which is a moderate party, versus the Democrats, which is another moderate party leaning more liberal, and the Union Party, which is a little bit more liberal but still moderate. So again, this is an example of three parties coalescing around the middle for whatever strategic reason. I think it's because if one shifts too far, then they'll lose support, so it only makes sense for them to compete for the center, and they would probably compete on more non-political stuff like how efficacious their policies are, that sort of thing. But in this timeline, anything weird happen? Let's see. Texas. Oh, in this timeline, we have Puerto Rico as a state. And that happens when one president is liberal. So we can see, let's see. We can scroll down and we can see that Puerto Rico became a state during the Lyndon Johnson presidency. So Lyndon Johnson got pretty woke. But we can see, again, we have a bunch of maps here. So interestingly, in 1832, the Federalists had already declined and there were the Union Party instead, led by Martin Van Buren as a conservative candidate. Then in 1880, we have the Whigs, led by Winfield S. Hancock versus the Union Party. Then in 1928, we have the Union Party again, led by Herbert Hoover, crushing the Dems, which only win, looks like... Sorry about that, there's a motorcycle or something. Then in 1976, we have Ted Kennedy leading the Union as a moderate party, winning a bunch of these states, while the Whigs, which are probably a bit more conservative in this period, winning the South. 2024, Joe Manchin, moderate, Whig, winning in a landslide, bunch of these states. 2064, so that's the future, Jared Golden, Union Party, wins with only 9% of the Electoral College votes. How is that possible? Well, what we can do is we can go over here and see why that happened. So 2064, which is the last election here, we can see that the Whigs controlled 40% of Congress according to the 2060 elections. So while Jared Golden won only 9% of votes and Electoral College votes, his party controlled Congress. So because no other candidate won over 50% of the Electoral College, the people in Congress voted for Jared Golden as the best of the top three presidential candidates according to their viewpoint. But we can see that, is there anything interesting? Well, actually, if you want to see if a timeline is interesting, you can just look right over here and see that this is a relaxing timeline. Nice and relaxing, nothing too crazy. There were no civil wars, no dictatorships. There's 3 expansions, so that would be Texas, California, and Puerto Rico. And 5 total parties control the presidency over history. So those would be the Federalists, the Jeffersonian Republicans, the Union Party, the Whigs, and the Democrats. And over here, oh, here's an interesting thing. So usually, as I said, when there are 3 major parties, they tend to coalesce around the middle. But it looks like in this timeline, the Whigs and the Union became more conservative in this time period, the mid-1900s, and the Democrats became more liberal, more progressive. So, for example, let's see what presidents were liberal or progressive. Well, we have Alvin W. Barkley, Adlai Stevenson, Lyndon Johnson, which we mentioned before, and, well, it looks like the Union became a little bit more moderate, and we had Ted Kennedy. But then we have Ronald Reagan, who in this timeline is a bit more moderate, leading the Whig Party to the presidency in the 1980s, but also Mario Cuomo. So we can see in this alternate timeline that parties switch around the middle of the axis and they acquire different political talent, which in real life were on opposite sides of the political aisle. Let's see, who was the most radical president? Well, just off this graph, it might be Thomas Jefferson, and then we can go over here and see the most radical one was in fact Thomas Jefferson, who was very progressive for his era, maybe a bit more progressive than he was in real life, so we can imagine in this timeline he wants to really weaken the power of the federal government. The most conservative might have been Charles Pinckney. Yeah, that seems to be the case, Charles Pinckney of the Union Party. So why did the Federalists collapse? Let's see. Well, looks like maybe there were major riots during Washington's presidency, and the Federalists probably collapsed after that. Let's look. Yeah, the Federalists didn't receive any of the vote in 1796. Did they receive any support? No, they collapsed, looks like. So George Washington, who in real life wasn't really officially a Federalist, but he was more sympathetic to the Federalists die in the cradle, and instead we have the Jeffersonian Republicans becoming the first major political party of America versus the Union Party. Well, the Union Party springs up later, but instead it's the Whigs. Well, we can see actually this is more accurate. Yep, the Union and the Whigs spring up for the 1800 presidential election because the Jeffersonian Republicans control basically 100% of political power in 1796. Okay, but that's enough with this timeline, the second timeline we have. Let's refresh it and see if we generate a more chaotic timeline than this one, which is categorized as relaxing. Give it a second to load. Popped up new stuff. Okay, let's see. This timeline is also relaxing. Sometimes you generate relaxing timelines, which I don't really mind. The more chaotic timelines are a bit hard to keep track of everything. The more relaxing timelines, you can see there are 2 major parties or 3 major parties, and they compete against each other. So in this timeline, looks like there are 2 major parties. The third one is pretty small, only 1% of the popular vote, and it's Democrats, who are more moderate, and Patriots, who are more conservative. So this is a lot like real life, except instead of the Patriots, instead of the Republicans, there's the Patriot Party. So let's see, Joe Manchin, leading the Democrats as a moderate candidate, won 58% of the vote. So that's a bunch of states, including California, New England. Let's see what that state is. So in case you do want to see what state it is, you can just scroll right down here to this key, and that would be Kentucky or Tennessee. Let's see, which one is that? Kentucky. So in this timeline, Joe Manchin won Kentucky in the 2024 presidential election, running on a bit of a more moderate-leaning liberal platform. 54% of the popular vote, 55%, and 58% of the Electoral College vote. But then we can see there were some other interesting presidents. So the best one is Rufus King. Now, the way I have this set up is that it excludes George Washington. Instead, it calculates which president had the best performance. So we see Rufus King in the 1810s. He won a major war. Now, we can actually scroll over and we can see if that major war was the acquisition of territory. And it looks like no. So maybe in the 1810s, America fought against Britain or France, which was pretty close to what happened in real life. And Rufus King triumphed, which is why the Federalists do so good afterwards. They stay in power until the 1840s when Henry Clay, who's the leader of the Republican Party in this timeline, takes power. So that's the best president, Rufus King. The worst president is Al Smith of the Democrats. And there's a major recession in the late 1820s, early 1830s, and that would be probably the Great Depression. And the way I have this coded is that in certain years, certain periods, there's more there's a greater likelihood of a crisis happening. So Al Smith got stuck with the hot potato of the Great Depression, which probably hurt the Democrats. Let's look if he lost. So we can scroll up. Where the heck is Al Smith? Here he is. Al Smith lost. And instead you have Franklin D. Roosevelt leading the Republican Party. So in this timeline, it looks like both the Democrats and the Republicans are liberals. Actually, let's look. So 1830s, we can scroll over and see. Yep, there was another major party then, the Patriot Party, which I bet was pretty conservative back then. Let's scroll back over and we can see the most radical president was James B. Weaver in the 1890s, more progressive. So that's probably a response to a crisis in the country. Political parties become more radical if there's a political crisis. Then we can scroll over. The longest serving president was Barack Obama, who served in office for 16 years, from 2009 to 2025. Let's see what happened there. So here we have Barack Obama, 4 terms in office. So in this timeline, obviously there isn't any constitutional amendment to prevent a president from serving in office more than twice. Barack Obama, pretty uneventful presidency, actually. He had a bit of a scandal in his second term, but besides that, he seems to have been mostly a caretaker president, which is probably why he kept winning. So, for example, if the Democrats naturally have a 70% approval rating and they don't do anything bad, people will just continue voting for them no matter what. So we can actually scroll down, and let's look at 2009. Let's highlight it so we can keep track. 2008, more like it. And the Democrats won a bunch of states, but they also lost some states. So let's look at this state that they lost. This state is Virginia. So in this timeline, Virginia is much more conservative than real life. Democrats picked it up around this period. This is Georgia, a bit more conservative. That makes sense. And we can see the different trends. That's a pretty cool thing, I think. This was inspired divinely. God came to me and told me to do this. That's a joke, in case you guys think I'm crazy. And we can also see the natural sways of the public, but it's weighted according to the power of the states that vote which way, right? So, for example, if California really boosts and it stays liberal, then that balances the country more towards the left. But also, if some states secede, that'll create a big shift. So, for example, if all the conservative states secede from the country's become a lot more liberal, and then the parties shift to respond to that. This timeline isn't too crazy. As we can see, it's a more relaxing timeline. So here's an interesting one. In 1976, Nelson Rockefeller won in a landslide. Patriots won basically every state except for, looks like Texas, interestingly. I guess Democrats were a bit more conservative in the 1976 presidential election. 2064, we have Chris Deluzio. Now, if you don't know who he is, let me pull him up. For the future elections, sorry, that's a weird typo I just made. Chris Deluzio. This is Chris Deluzio. For the future elections, I just picked some promising young politicians who seem likely to me to eventually serve in office, and I said, you know what, maybe they'll be president in the future. So in 2064, we have Chris Deluzio, a liberal, winning with 54% of the Electoral College vote. And we can see that he actually creates some weird shifts in the country. So Oregon votes more patriot. Now maybe the party's more, no, actually, look, it's more conservative. So the Patriots, by that I mean the Patriots stay conservative, the Democrats stay liberal, but I guess the states have shifted in that time period, right? So Kentucky is more liberal than Oregon in 2064, and maybe that's more accurate to real life, who knows? Anyways, let's get a more chaotic timeline. This is another relaxing timeline. Let's wait for it to fully load. One minus of adding all this stuff into Google Sheets so everyone can have it is that sometimes it takes a second to load, but thankfully, if you're not in a rush, you can just wait a second. In this timeline, another usual relaxing timeline, Joe Manchin, Whig Party, we've all seen it before, Union Party, whatever. Let's refresh it, try to get a more crazy result. This is a thing I brought up in the last video, but refreshing it until you get interesting results is kind of like playing a slot machine at a casino. So if you, in case you want to waste weeks of your life, you can get this and then just endlessly refresh it. Anyways, okay, so in this timeline, Kamala Harris won the 2024 presidential election with 52% of the Electoral College as the leader of the Union Party. Now that's very interesting because the Union Party, well, Kamala Harris is a liberal candidate, but it looks like she was going against a more liberal party, the Populist Party. So in this timeline, people are much more left-wing. And here's an interesting thing. So I talked about this in the last video about this whole thing, but we can scroll all the way over here, past all this data that I plug in. We can see the party shifts over here, but we can also see which parts of the country are not impressed by the candidates. So in 2024, here it is. Yep, we can see that the liberals are overserved. So the liberals are very happy with the two parties because the two major parties are liberal parties. But the conservatives over here on the right side of the axis are underrepresented. So if a party shifts in the future towards the conservative direction, they'll pick up more votes. And if we go over here, oh, see, this is another case. Now, this is interesting. There's 4 major parties, and they all cluster toward the middle because they're all competing for the center of the axis. And if one shifts off towards the left, they'll lose out because it's just not worth it. So we can see in the 2024 election, we have the Union Party, the Populist Party, and the Liberal Party, and they're all in the middle of the aisle. Now, the two first ones are a bit more liberal, ironically. The Liberal Party is more moderate. Oh, and here's an interesting thing. Wow, would you look at that? Lots of secession. Let's see when that happened. So we can scroll up and we can see when that civil war happened. So the country had 2 civil wars. One of them caused a bunch of states to secede. Let's see where I can find that. Right over here. So detailed political history, you can see where the civil wars and everything was. Okay, so 2 civil wars in the early 1900s. This is maybe over economic policy, maybe over progressivism versus conservatism, that sort of thing. So first one was during the term of Alton B. Parker. Second one was during the term of William H. Taft. 2 civil wars. Let's scroll all the way down here. Yep. In 1916, we can see a bunch of states seceded against the presidency of the person who I just said, whatever the heck their name is. Interesting. So they seceded for the 1916 presidential election during the term of William Howard Taft, who in this timeline is very progressive. So he starts off more moderate and then he shifts in the radical direction, which causes all the conservative states to secede from the country. Now, it's not just economic conservatism, but also social and racial conservatism, right? That's all plugged in. That's all included in this number. So if we scroll down here, we can see that Connecticut seceded, probably for economic reasons. They didn't want a radical socialist becoming president, but also some southern states. So Georgia seceded as well. So maybe William Howard Taft was too progressive when it came to civil rights or something like that. But then in 2004, they all joined the country again. And I plugged that in so that happens when there's a popular president of America, the seceded states might rejoin the Union and reunify the country. So in 2004, the president was John McCain. So we have John McCain, and this is a major war win, by the way, which suggests that he conquered all those states and brought them back into the country. So instead of America invading Iraq and Afghanistan, America invades Georgia. Now, in real life, maybe they were close to invading Georgia. Well, not really, but Georgia of the Caucasus versus Georgia of real life, that's the difference here. So John McCain conquered Georgia and reunited the country, but it didn't really help him because John Kerry became president right afterwards. So we can see actually how that shifts the country. So when... Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, okay, so what happens is the country is around average 0.35 on the left to right scale, so it's a bit more conservative. But when all the conservative states secede, well, the country becomes much more liberal. But then in 2005, 2004, the country shifts back towards the center when all these conservative states, ranging from Georgia to Alabama probably, I bet you Alabama, South Carolina, those sorts of states, they seceded, they rejoined the country, and the country became moderate again. And let's see if that's reflected. Yep. So we see over here that the parties were a bit more negative. So we have a radical left-wing party over here. But then once the states rejoin in this period, well, then there's a higher demand for conservative parties. So the Republicans shift in the conservative direction. And they all, vibrate around the center of the political axis. Okay, let's look at another timeline. That's probably like the fourth timeline. I don't even know what I'm talking about anymore. Okay. This timeline, let's let it load, is an odd timeline, which means that there's some strange things that happen, but it's not very crazy. So there's one civil war in this timeline, there's 3 expansions, which would be, well, there you go, what a perfect example. You just refresh it and new things pop up. So in this timeline, America conquered Canada. We can see that Quebec too also joined. So let's see, when did we conquer the Canadians? So Canada we conquered. Theodore Roosevelt conquered Canada in this timeline. And then Quebec, I guess Quebec didn't join. Oh yeah, that's the blank one over here is Quebec. We can see that, yeah. Quebec didn't join, but Newfoundland and Ontario, however the heck you pronounce it on the Canadian accent, Columbia, in this timeline it's Jefferson, Puerto Rico, and then I guess Cuba. Well, Puerto Rico and Cuba did not join, but it's just the Canadians. So we can see that in this timeline, the Canadians vote for the Democrats in 1976. Look at that. Jimmy Carter won in a landslide election, and he's definitely helped by the fact that all the Canadians who Theodore Roosevelt conquered joined and voted for him. Look at that. They voted for the Liberals too. And look, if you get this spreadsheet, I know I don't want to be a salesman here, but if you get this spreadsheet, you can just refresh it as many times as you want, and you can see all the different alternate history stuff that pops up. Look at that. Oh, well, look at that. Doesn't that make sense? So what happens is, in 1897 to 1899, right, more like 1801, John M. Palmer, let's pull him up. John M. Palmer. Pretty hard to type when there's a mic in front of your face. John M. Palmer was president of the United States. General who fought for the Union during the Civil War, anti-slavery, but a Bourbon Democrat, so a more conservative political figure. And in this timeline, he becomes president, but he fails to solve the crisis that's building in the country. Who knows what it's about? Maybe about economic reasons, that sort of thing. But then, and that's when, did any states secede? No states seceded, thankfully, for America. But then Theodore Roosevelt pops in as leader of a third party, and he solves the crisis. Wow, would you look at that? And he's reelected in 1905 and 1904 as the leader of a liberal party. Then we have the Liberals, the Unions, the Union Party, and the Democrats as the 3 major parties. So interestingly, I'm not sure why this happens, maybe it's how I coded it, but it seems to be a trend that there are 3 major parties in all these timelines. Now, if I refresh it enough, I'll find plenty of timelines where there's 2 major parties, but in this timeline, there are 3 major parties, and they coalesce around the middle of the political axis. But you can see that sometimes they become more radical. And that's especially when there's a political crisis. So when America's stable, it seems the parties coalesce around the middle, because there's nothing anything to be radical about. But then when there's a political crisis, they get pushed towards the edges. And you know what? I've coded it to be that way. When there's a political crisis, the parties become more radical in response. Okay, let's refresh it again and hope I get a more chaotic timeline. I want one where there's a bunch of civil wars. Okay, in this timeline, there are 2 civil wars. There's 5 expansions. That's pretty good for America. Oh. Would you look at that? It disappeared. 1 civil war, 2 expansions. That's pretty boring. Joe Biden, 91% moderate party, bunch of states against the more liberal populist party, and a third party that gets a little bit of the vote. So not very interesting, but it looks like the Republicans hold on to the presidency for a while. Actually, no, they don't. Just the most noteworthy presidents are Republicans here, including Theodore Roosevelt, who, in this timeline, was one of the worst presidents, because he failed to solve the crisis of the nation. Okay, in this timeline, hopefully it doesn't disappear again, there are 3 civil wars, 3 expansions, so that includes Puerto Rico, Texas, California, and 7 total parties that control the presidency. Okay, so in this timeline, there's the Democrats around, but by the mid-2000s, by the mid-2000s, so of this century, it's just the Patriots versus the Republicans. Interestingly, we see that they didn't coalesce around the center over here, but the Patriots were a more conservative party. Let's look at this 2024 presidential election map for some more interesting information. So Joe Biden did not win in a landslide election, but only 26% of the Electoral College vote as the leader of the moderate Democrats. So the Republicans are a bit more liberal, so they won the more liberal states. The Patriots are more conservative, so they won the more conservative states in the South. And the Democrats won the more moderate states. Now, of course, if you remember, because he won 26% of the Electoral College, that suggests that no other party won a majority, and instead, it was a matter of a congressional election instead. And sure enough, we look, the Democrats, after years of Jim Webb and Joe Biden, the Democrats controlled Congress with nearly 60% of the seats. So as a result, Joe Biden is able to win despite getting a pretty bad result. And I wonder why he got a bad result. So let's look to Joe Biden's first term, and there was a major recession which caused him to lose all support, and he dipped down, but he still had enough support in Congress to claim the presidency again. Let's see, what are some other interesting things I could show you? Oh, okay, this is an interesting one. This is a unsettling timeline. So there are 4 civil wars, 6 expansions, so including Canada, and 8 total parties that control the presidency. So let's look to see what all those civil wars were about. There we go. So mid-1800s, those are definitely civil wars over slavery. And then look, another civil war in the 1900s, in the late 1800s, probably over economic issues. Then look at that. We got a civil war in the 1980s, 1990s probably, over, who knows, economic policy, something like that. You can use whatever you think, whatever your imagination tells you. But then, Bill Clinton saves the country, and also Ralph Nader does a pretty good job too. So the country is reunified with the liberals, the Democrats, and the Union Party. Let's see, what's an interesting thing? Did any states secede? Let's check it out. Let's scroll down here. Oh my god. That's not good. Okay. Which states stayed in the country? Oh my god. That is not good. Which states California? Okay, that's a pretty big state. Minnesota, Oregon, Kansas, and Nevada stayed in the country, and all the other states seceded. So basically every state west of or east of the Rocky Mountains seceded from the country for whatever reason. I guess they didn't really like Hannibal Hamlin or Abraham Lincoln or Horatio Seymour. Well, I guess more like James Buchanan, right? So the Civil War caused basically everybody to secede from the country. I don't know how that worked. Maybe they seceded into 2 separate northern and southern states, right? But then eventually the country continues to grow. California is obviously the heart of this new country. Well, it's still the United States. And then eventually they rejoined. So who rejoined the country? I guess it was Bill Clinton, right? We saw that before. Or Ralph Nader. Maybe Bill Clinton or Ralph Nader. Depends what you want to say. I think technically it should be Bill Clinton because Bill Clinton had the support and they all popped back in for the 1996 presidential election. And for whatever reason, Bill Clinton does not run again. Maybe he was assassinated or something, right? So Bill Clinton doesn't run again in 1996 and Ralph Nader, his heir apparent, wins the reunited United States. And it's a sweep. Look at that. All these formerly seceded states win to they all voted for the Liberal Party. And ironically, look at that. The Liberal Party sweeps, so a landslide election. Interestingly, I think what this means is that, look at that. So sometimes there's some weird results, right? So Cuba becomes part of the United States, even though none of the eastern seaboard is controlled by the United States. And also, Newfoundland, too, and Nova Scotia were part of the United States. I guess it's like California and Canada unite into a new country, and everyone else is just, pissed off at them. But then, as we can see, they're reunited in the 1990s, and they vote for the Union Party and the Democrats. So you can see there's tons of weird timelines that pop up. Oh, look at that. And we can see that when there's two parties, they polarize, right? So the Union Party up here is more right-wing, and the Democrats are more left-wing down here. But then when the third party pops up, they all coalesce around the middle. Republicans were around for a little bit, not very significant. And there's a major third party over here. But let's refresh. So this is an unsettling timeline. Let's see if we can get... Oh, look at that. So sometimes, here's something I want to point out. If we remember, basically all the states seceded except for California. Sometimes every single state secedes, right? Now, I could code it so that if every single state seceded, they all hop back into the country and the timeline continues. But I think it's pretty interesting to have that. And when that happens, because there's no states voting, everything becomes divided by 0, and it's all cleared out below the point where every state seceded. So that's a pretty interesting result. Sometimes that happens. It's pretty rare. If you refresh it enough times, you'll see it. Let's refresh it again. I could keep ranting about this for another hour. It's been like half an hour at this point. I guess I'll just keep doing it until, oh, look at that. Perfect. We have another example of something interesting happening. Oh, it disappeared. So sometimes that happens. I don't know why Google Sheets does that. Sometimes you refresh. Oh, look at that. It's happening again. Whatever. So sometimes Google Sheets will refresh and refresh, even though you only meant it to refresh once, and then you'll lose an interesting result. But if you just refresh it again, a new interesting result will pop up. So we saw briefly that I think it was it Joe Manchin? Somebody was a dictator, and that happens if there's a political crisis and they're radical enough, or if there's a civil war and they want to reunify the country. Sometimes dictatorships pop up, and if there's a dictatorship, sometimes the dictatorships stay in power for a bunch of election cycles. I saw one time it was like 60 years of dictatorship, which is like Soviet Union level dictatorship. And in those situations, there's some elections, but they're not free or fair. So the majority party that controls the new dictatorial government, they'll get like 90% of the vote, and the other parties will compete against each other and not really win anything until eventually the system collapses for whatever reason, whether it's a civil war or a major recession or maybe a major scandal. So let's keep refreshing. You know what? I'm just going to keep refreshing until I get a dictatorship again. See, I think sometimes Google Sheets saves like a default version, and that pops up, but then it disappears when it actually refreshes. That's interesting. I'm not sure why Google Sheets does that. I mean, this is honestly the best way I can communicate this spreadsheet. If I gave you an Excel, there would be all sorts of issues with, my name being on it. Instead, this is more anonymous. So it's a Google Sheets. If you go on my patreon.com/whatwhyhow, I don't know why I did that voice. If you go on patreon.com/whatwhyhow, you can access this spreadsheet. Also, you can probably purchase it. I'll set a purchase option as well. And you know what? I am kind of selling this. I am kind of shilling it, but I think it's pretty cool. I've been doing this for like a month straight of my free time making this spreadsheet. And I want an interesting result. So here we have President Marco Rubio overseeing a recession. Not a good job, even though he won in a landslide in 2024 against the agrarians and the Democrats. And we can see, the Republicans, and this is the Jeffersonian Republican Party, so this has been around for a while. They're more conservative in this time period. So let's refresh again. We'll see the dictatorship pop up again. John C. Breckinridge during the Civil War period, so probably in response to the crisis, right? Here, this timeline, 1 civil war, 3 expansions, 8 total presidency parties. Joe Manchin won. Refresh. In this new gigantic spreadsheet with all these different states and everything, it takes more of a second. It takes more of a moment to reload, but, that's just what it is. Let's see, 3 dictatorships. Oh, well, this is the default timeline. I got excited for a second. Including John C. Breckinridge. I guess John C. Breckinridge. Let's see if we can see it. No, it's reloading. Nine civil wars in this timeline. Oh my god. Okay. Yeah, okay. And both parties are very radical. We got a nationalist party and another nationalist party and a more moderate party. The more nationalist party is led by Nikki Haley. So for whatever reason, I think that, the Liberal Party might be too radical for these conservative states. So the Liberals win like Georgia, which in this timeline is very conservative. Look at that. It's so very chaotic. I bet you there's a bunch of civil wars happening over the past century. Let's see. We can scroll over here to here's the Electoral College vote, but we want to do the more detailed political history. Look at that. Civil War. Oh my god. That's not good for America. Okay, so for the 2030s, 2040s, and into the 2050s, there's just civil war after civil war after civil war. And you know what that is? Let's see, when did the country become unstable? Well, it was never really stable, never really recovered. So look at that. So it's 100% stability under George Washington. Thank you, President George Washington. Then it becomes unstable over time over the issue of slavery. Then it just never recovers. So America is just always unstable. Now, I hate to sound a bit, un-PC, but this might be comparable to a country like Mexico or Peru or something like that, where there's just constant political instability and constant political feuds between major presidential factions. So look at that. Let's see what happened here. Hillary Clinton, major war loss. That's not good, President Hillary Clinton. So she must have lost 2017, maybe a war against Russia or something like that for such a big value. But then we have a scandal, Nikki Haley scandal, good feelings. So you know what? She didn't do that bad. But then she's barely holding the country together. And then in the 2032 presidential election, well, during Pete Buttigieg's term after the 2032 presidential election, there's a civil war, and it just keeps going and going until, look at that, that's got to be pretty bad. Maybe that's like a nuclear exchange or something like that. But then Brandon Gill, let's see, did any states secede? Look at that. Not good. So we have Florida, Arkansas, Illinois, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, South Carolina, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, New York too. So I don't know why New York's over here. New Jersey, New Hampshire, Massachusetts all seceding. And Connecticut too. So that's like conservative states and progressive states seceding because of I guess it must have been, look at that, Josh Hawley. Look at that. He did not do a good job. So Josh Hawley, this is when all those states seceded, and they just stayed seceded. So eventually, if a president did a good job in the 2070s or something like that, the country would reunite. But for now, America is in a pretty crappy situation. No dictatorships, though. So I guess that's a positive. But you know what? I have it so dictatorships kind of stabilize the country. So in this timeline, maybe a nice, sensible, rational, kind dictator wouldn't be too bad, considering the fact that there's like 50 civil wars. Let's see, anything interesting down here? Look at that. You can see the states that seceded. America's just in chaos. Oh, look at that. And also, because in the Mexican invasion, in the Mexican War, what's it called? The Mexican-American War, we conquered Sonora and Chihuahua. So we have those two states, and they stay in the Union despite Florida seceding. So I guess they really like America in this timeline. And Puerto Rico's a state, too. I don't know why they didn't secede. I guess they weren't crazy enough. Okay. So that's this timeline, timeline 6, 7, I don't even know what number timeline it is. Here we can see the default timeline is popping up. You probably might not see that because I'm the owner of the document. You might not see this default timeline, and it'll probably change over time too. Okay, 3 expansions, 6 parties, no civil wars, no dictatorships. That means moving on to the next one. This is an odd timeline, so not too crazy. We got 4 expansions, Puerto Rico, and... oh, that's Hawaii, of course. Texas, California. What's the 4th one? Texas, California? Oh, Puerto Rico and Cuba? No, just Puerto Rico. How am I? Oh. Mexico. Look at that. I always forgot about Sonora and Chihuahua. Sonora and Chihuahua vote for the Democrats. They vote for Joe Biden in the 2024 presidential election. Moderate versus the Republicans, who are a bit more liberal, and Whigs, who are a bit more conservative. Look at that. Joe Biden, Walter Mondale, Jimmy Carter, worst. Sorry, Jimmy Carter. Most radical is Walter Mondale, who is a nationalist for some... What happened there? Walter Mondale became a radical nationalist? Oh my god, that is weird. Look at that. So Walter Mondale, if you don't know, Walter Mondale, I'm pretty sure, was he the vice presidential candidate? Former vice president of the United States. Democrat, liberal Democrat, becomes radical. That's weird. I guess because of the recession, he became a radical, and he solved a national crisis. Okay. Sometimes weird things happen. So, geez, Walter Mondale. I guess you really dragged the Whigs in this timeline from the Liberal Party to a nationalist party. Okay, whatever. So then the Dems win as a moderate party. But then look at that, Ross Perot. So I have some weird candidates. Ross Perot won. John Kasich won 4 terms. Look at that. Joe Biden 3 terms. What was I looking for? No dictatorships, no civil wars, just some weird stuff. Longest, yeah, we can see Walter Mondale. Oh, John Kasich, 16 years as president. That's a long time. But I guess it makes sense in this timeline. Okay, here was the default timeline again. Let's refresh. Okay, in this timeline, 1 civil war, 5 expansions. So that's Canada, of course. Now, I have Quebec being a pretty rare acquisition for the United States, because Canada makes more sense as an English-speaking country. Quebec being French-speaking, I imagine at any timeline where America invades Canada after like 1815, that Quebec would probably want to be an independent country. If America tried to conquer them, probably a big issue. But in any case, we have Cuba in this timeline. So Cuba is one of the rare acquisitions. We tried to acquire it a bunch of times in real life. We never really full-heartedly committed, and by the time we tried, it was too late. But then look at that. Longest Robert La Follette for 16 years. John C. Fremont, look at that. That makes sense. Revolutionary. Theodore Roosevelt, sorry, Mr. Roosevelt, you got stuck with the Civil War. But Thomas L. Hisgen, I don't even know who that is. Thomas L. Hisgen, petroleum producer and politician, Standard Oil Trust, so a bit more conservative, Independence Party in the 1908 presidential election. I think what happened is, so what happened in the 1900s, in case you don't know, is that there was all this feuding over progressivism versus conservatism in both major parties. So when a party nominated a bit more progressive of a candidate, the conservatives bolted and started their own parties. Most of them didn't work out, but if you remember, there was a states' rights party, and then in 1948, the progressives the progressives fled President Harry Truman and voted for Henry Wallace instead. But this timeline, there is a civil war, but there's no dictatorship, so I'm going to refresh again. I got to seek out that dictatorship. I could really rant, so this is around 45 minutes probably so far in the edit. I could just rant about this for like 3 more hours, obviously. Okay, relaxing timeline, Dems do pretty good, Kamala Harris, miraculous win. Look at that, Millard Fillmore, Mario Cuomo, not good, lost a major war in the 1980s, 1990s. Not good. Hannibal Hamlin, most radical progressive. Richard Nixon for 16 years. Wow. Let's see, what's the worst thing that Nixon faced? Maybe he faced a scandal. That would be funny. Look at that. Richard Nixon. No scandals for Richard Nixon. Now, wait a second. Did it say 16 years? Or did it say 12 years? 16 years. That's interesting. 1961 to 1970s. Oh, what happened is, okay, so sometimes what happens is there's an issue with non-contiguous presidents. I would have to code a whole additional thing for that to make sense, for it to calculate it right. But what happened in this timeline is Nixon won the 1960 presidential election. He lost the 1964 presidential election to Lyndon B. Johnson, but then he won the 1968 presidential election. He came back to office, and he won a major war win. 1968, let's see if anything interesting happened down there. No acquisitions, so probably he won the Vietnam War in this timeline. But he was in office total for 16 years. This is a bit glitchy, but that's what it is. Let's refresh away from this relaxing timeline. I want to get a crazy timeline. Okay, so we got the baseline crazy timeline of 3 dictatorships, but it's not crazy enough, and we're not going to be able to see it before it disappears. No dictatorships. Let's refresh again. Oh, we finally got a dictatorship. Look at that. We got civil wars, 3 of them. We got 2 expansions. That's not too crazy. Texas and California. 8 total parties, but 2 terms of a presidential dictator. And I betcha it's Henry Clay. Let's see. Let's see exactly what happened. So we can scroll over. These are the presidents, if you remember, and this is the detailed political history. So we have George Washington twice, makes sense. Thomas Jefferson, makes sense. John Jay, Federalist. George Clinton for 3 terms. James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson. And look at that. Okay, so Henry Clay, wow. Okay, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 terms as president. Okay. 1832, we've got Henry Clay elected president on a radical platform. Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams are too conservative. Henry Clay in real life was pro-industrial development, pro-infrastructure, so he's radical. So he wants, like, America to, like, take over states and build railroads. That's his radicalism. And he's so radical that when he wins when he scores very good on the dice roll, by the way, but for whatever reason, he managed to acquire enough political power to cement his power as a dictator. Now, of course, in universe, in this timeline, maybe he wasn't like out and out a dictator, but the more realistic thing would probably be like, oh, my rival political party, the Federalists, are committing all these tax fraud crimes, all these various things that require me to ban their candidates or prosecute their candidates, and that's how he becomes a dictator for 2 presidential election terms. Let's see. So he gets 90. So what happens is, because he's a dictator, I have calculated their approval of dictators to be pretty high up. And then he wins, look at that, 81% and 87% of the Electoral College against, look at that, the Union Party, 15. And then, so what happens is, I think the Federalists break apart into the Democrats, the Union, and then and then a third party. And the Democrats, obviously, are more progressive under Henry Clay. But then, for whatever reason, he decides not to be a dictator anymore, so perhaps he loses the political power he acquired, and he can no longer prosecute his political nemesi, however the plural is, and he becomes more moderate too. So he no longer a dictator in the 1840s. He loses a major war, which costs him all his political capital. He stays in power for one more office, and then the Union Party, who are conservative, win the 1852 presidential election under Franklin Pierce. But then, look at that. So Henry Clay kept the country together, and then Franklin Pierce ruined it. So Franklin Pierce, Stephen Douglas ruined the country, drive us into chaos and civil war, probably over slavery. Then we have a civil war, another civil war, a third civil war. And then, look at that, Alton B. Parker. Let's pull him up. Alton B. Parker, who, I wonder, did he actually run for political office? I forget. But he's a New York Supreme Court judge. Yeah, he was the Democratic nominee in the 1904 presidential election, losing in a landslide to Theodore Roosevelt, so that's too bad for Parker. But in this timeline, he won in 1904, and he reunited the country after decades of civil war, so congratulations to him. But the true uniter-in-chief is John Blaine. Now, nobody knows John Blaine anymore. I don't even remember who he is, so I'm going to pull him up. John Blaine, American lawyer and politician, 24th governor of Wisconsin, 3 terms in office, so congratulations to John Blaine, and he was a really good president, turns out, as a leader of the Liberal Party. So he really reunited the country after the chaos of the late 1800s and the tentative stability of the early 1900s. Then America's doing pretty good. So maybe, look at that, major war win, John Blaine, 1930s. I think President John Blaine won World War II, and he won it pretty good, thus reuniting the country. But then, as we can see, sometimes parties do well and they stay in power for a long time, but sometimes, eventually, their debts catch up to them, and they lose. So Adlai Stevenson, not a very popular president, and there was a recession, and also scandal, recession. So this whittles away the Liberals until the Patriots win back power. And there are no more dictators. Instead, we have Al Gore, Hillary Clinton for 3 terms, Pete Buttigieg, Gavin Newsom, Sarah H. Sanders, Chip Roy. Did I just shift something? No, I don't think so. Everything's fine. If I shifted something, it would have edited the whole thing, so we're fine. Okay, so that's this timeline. Let's do one more timeline. Actually, let's do one more crazy timeline. So let's refresh. I could just rant about this for an hour. I know I said that like 3 times, and my recording timeline is, at this point, up to an hour. But look at, okay, 3, nope, that was the default, and it's gone. This is an odd timeline, very yellow timeline. Moderate liberals leaning more but conservative, Whigs are more liberal, and there's a third progressive party. And that's going to be Chris Christie as the leader of the moderates. Anything interesting here? Look at that. James Garfield won pretty good. Moderates, Union Party, ironically wins the southern states. If you don't know why that's ironic, the Union Party was the anti-secession party after the Civil War. That's the idea behind this party. It's like a moderate party that can reunite the country. So, in case you don't know, in case you forgot from the last video, I've coded some parties to stay a certain way. I've coded other parties to just be whatever the people need. So, for example, the Socialist Party, which pops up rarely, looks like. Oh, but you know what I could do? Here's something I could do. For your benefit, I'm going to edit the spreadsheet. So over here, all the way over here, we have the initial starting point of the country. Most people are liberal, moderate, or conservative, and there's a little bit revolutionary, a little bit progressive, a little bit nationalist, a little bit authoritarian. And over time, as the moderate candidates do poorly, it shifts and moves towards the radical directions. But if we start off, let's say we have, let's do let's start with 100 revolutionaries, 100 progressives, just to get a socialist party. I bet it'll pop up now. So we can go all the way back over here. Any socialists? No socialists. Look at it, it's unsettling. So already we see, just by changing the starting conditions of the country, the political situation, well, now this is just an odd timeline, but just by changing the starting conditions of a country, we get much different results. So you can see how maybe the history of Mexico, which had a very unstable political system from the start, maybe that contributes to the ongoing political instability in Mexico, whereas America, which had a stable political system, more or less from the start, contributes to the ongoing stability relative of the American political system. Look at that. Okay, so because there's so many more left-wing people, we got a major revolutionary political party, the Populists, who are so revolutionary. Look at that. They are basically socialist revolutionaries in this time period. And then in response, we have the Patriot Party. Oh, sorry, I mixed it up. So the Republicans are conservatives, radical conservatives, and the Populists down here are radical socialist revolutionaries. But let's see if we can get the Socialist Party to pop up. There's a delicate balance because sometimes the major political parties move and shift to acquire the land that's held by the socialists, and sometimes a socialist party springs up when the major parties don't solve the demand for a socialist party. So look at that. We can see that in this timeline, look at that, radical. Let's do one more. Actually, I'm just going to keep refreshing it because I have all day to get a socialist party. No social. Oh, okay, here we go. We got a socialist party at last. Let's give it a second to load. Ooh, you guys are going to like this one. Bernie Sanders won the 2024 presidential election as a socialist. Very progressive. That's negative 7.3 out of 10 on the scale of progressivism. Look at that. So he got elected in 2024, re-elected in 2024. I mean, he was elected in 2020, re-elected in 2024. Look at that, because we have the Republicans, Nationalists, Democrats, Moderate, and Socialists, who are, of course, progressive. Look at that. So they pop up, peak under Bernie Sanders. Look at that. That's a beauty. And that's an interesting timeline. Look at this. So we have the Socialists winning these states in the middle of the country. How come they won those? That's going to be, what is that? Nebraska, Missouri, and Illinois. Look at that. And of course, that's Minnesota, Michigan, Washington, of course, a bunch of New England. This is probably New Hampshire. He didn't win Vermont, though. So in this time, okay, in case you don't know the history, and this is one of the early What Will I Have videos, by the way, so you should check it out. But the reason Vermont is so progressive, but it's still a pretty rural state, is basically because all the hippies from Boston and elsewhere moved to Vermont. So in this timeline, they moved to New Hampshire instead, and that's a much more progressive state than Democratic Vermont. Look at that. We got some interesting results here. So how come the socialists popped up? They popped up, looks like over there. Let's scroll over. Joe Biden being a socialist. Okay, so in this timeline, Joe Biden is a socialist president. Look at that. Two terms. Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, comrades at last. Okay, but why did the socialists pop up? Okay, so they popped up all the way back here in the 1990s. Definitely because the two major parties were not left-wing enough. They weren't meeting the demand of all the left-wing people we added back in the 1790s, and there's just a continuing tradition of radical left-wing people in America until the 1990s. Look at that. Interestingly, look at that. Okay, so it's definitely a response to this period in American history. So Ted Kennedy is a moderate to conservative. Look at that. He hopped really conservative. Ronald Reagan, moderate. Walter Mondale, liberal. George H.W. Bush, moderate. Ross Perot, conservative. Then the country demands a more radical left-wing party. So the Democrats shift in the liberal direction, but it's not enough. And the Socialist Party springs up in this time period, and they win the 2012 presidential election, defeating John Edwards, VP, probably, right? But then the progressives don't do very well. For whatever reason, they fade away. This is just bad luck, looks like. So there's no major issues, except for a recession and scandal under Joe Biden. But Bernie Sanders does pretty well, except people just don't like him. I'm sorry, Bernie Sanders. E-Day approval is down to 27. That's a pretty bad roll. So that's just bad luck. Then, of course, J.D. Vance wins 2028 conservatives. Richard Spencer. Okay, that's not even good. Look at that. We got Richard Spencer 2 terms as president. Then Josh Hawley, Thomas Massey, Tim Sheehy. See who that is? Probably a Republican congressman, right? United States Senator, bit conservative. I think, is this the guy? Yeah, I think this is the guy who just broke that guy's arm. So in this timeline, he becomes president in 2052, or 2053, he becomes president. We can scroll over here, see the 2064 presidential election. That's 2024. We must see 2064. Yeah, so the socialists are gone by then, and the Democrats are a bit more progressive. So we got our Socialist Party at last. You want to do one more? Let's do one more. This is a relaxing timeline. Pretty boring, but look, the country has shifted a bit more left. I wonder why that is. Any states seceded? Nope, it's because I added all those left-wing people in the beginning of the country, so that the center of the political axis is down here. That's why they're coalescing around here. Let's do one more refresh. A relaxing timeline. Look at that. Look at this. The Federalists won. No Socialist Party though. But they're all the way down here. So the 2 major parties have shifted leftward to claim the real estate of the left wing, thus cutting the knees out of any socialist movement. And again, look, well, actually, that's not too bad. So what happens is, let's see if that happened in real life. Let's see if that happened in this timeline. What happens is, if the presidents who are left-wing aren't doing a good job, people will shift towards the right. So we can see percentages. Look at that. So nationalists start off with 1% of support in the country, but because all the moderates and the liberals and the progressive presidents don't do a good job, they slowly grow in support over time. Whereas the revolutionaries stay between 12 and 14%, the progressives stay at 12%, and the liberals sink in their support. Oh, didn't mean to do that. And also the moderates and conservatives sink in their support as well. Oh, gotta do it back. Let's fix that error. Okay, there we go, it's fixed. Now, one factor, of course, is the reason why it's been a bit slow today is because I am recording both audio and my screen right now, so there's a bit of a memory occupation. Okay, so let's fix this. Let's go put it back to how it was. So 1, and 10. And let's see how it adjusts. So if you see, look at that. Much smaller, 68, 168, 266, 240, 217, 76, 76. So it's smaller than real life. But interestingly, the progressives are still pretty large, which suggests that 119, 106, look at that. So if a president does bad, people shift in the other direction. Look at this. Okay, that is it. No dictatorships. Interesting. So the Patriot Party just does really well. 2000 is a landslide election. Jim Webb. No, that's 2012. 2000 is Al Gore. So the Patriots are a moderate party. Interesting. Let's see if we can get one more weird result. And of course, we're seeing a lot of populists, we're seeing a lot of Union, we're seeing a lot of Democrats, Federalists, Whigs, Republicans, but there's other parties too that are more rare, right? So we can scroll over here. We got National Party, which pops up in certain conditions, the Progressive Party, which pops up in certain conditions, Agrarian, we saw a couple of those, Socialist, Liberal, we've seen a lot, Patriot, we've seen a lot. So there are more rare parties that pop up in specific conditions that are not always met. But if you refresh the chart enough, you'll see it eventually. The most rare party is probably the Progressive Party, which pops up in similar conditions as the Socialist Party if more center-left people are not satisfied. Right? Patriots pop up if the right wing is not satisfied. The liberal is more if the liberals don't. If the liberals aren't satisfied, and these parties pop up if, like, the Federalists get 100% of the vote, then they split in half between different political parties. This is an odd timeline. Doesn't seem very odd to me. Pretty usual. Let's refresh it again. Look at that, J.D. Vance was elected to office for 4 terms in this timeline. Interesting. 16 years of J.D. Vance and the country survives miraculously. Okay, refresh one more time. Please give me a dictatorship. I just want a dictatorship. No dictatorship. 3 civil wars, though. Any secession? No secession, so those were not state versus state, but more like people rising up. Refresh. Look at this. Well, that's an interesting result. In this timeline, there were no expansions. So America just basically expanded however they could without, conquering places, right? So there's no California in the country. Look at that. No California. And no, what state is that? No Nevada either, but there is Utah. Look at that. This is a rare result because America conquering. Look at that. And that's because everything is so relaxing and calm in this timeline. It's just 200 years of just moderate parties competing for power. Let's see. Oh, but we do have a radical guy over here. John Marshall, 3.6. But that's not really that radical. 7.6, Thomas Jefferson. Now, why did he switch? Strange. Oh, but look at that. Okay, so what happened is George Washington did a really bad job. Thomas Jefferson took control, did a pretty bad job, but then he was reelected under a different party, the Democrats, the Progressive Democrats. Economic boom, so he did pretty good afterwards. And then the country's just pretty fine. There's some periods of instability, but everything's just chill. Look at that. Who's the longest serving president in this timeline? 12 years, Dwight Eisenhower, not bad. What's the craziest thing that happens? Major war win, 1850, so that's probably he defeated any secessionists. Good for James Buchanan. In real life, he basically sat on his hands. In this timeline, he defeated the secessionists and reunited the country. Major war win, Dwight Eisenhower, shout out. 1970s, Jimmy Carter, major war win. Look at that. But then he lost a war. Sorry, Jimmy Carter. 1980s, that's probably like Grenada, or, well, it could be any war. Look at that. What a relaxing world to live in. Just no, there's no California either. That contributes to the relaxation. Actually, people, California could be a separate country, and all the political problems of the country are just in California. Let's see. I'm rolling the dice one more time, praying for a dictatorship. 2 civil wars, 3 expansions, 8 parties, but no dictatorship. Too bad. There's the Americans, though. The American Party's an interesting thing. I kind of like that color. Oh, but they both shift very right-wing. I don't know why they did that. Look at that, it's chaos. So Thomas Massey, did a pretty bad job as president. And everybody shifts in a radical direction. So the liberals shift into a nationalist direction. Shout out to Marie G. Perez. And Pat Harrigan of the Democrats also shifts in a conservative direction. So sometimes both parties randomly shift in a direction. The liberals moved much more conservative over here in the 1980s and 1990s. Who would that be? Let's see. During the Ronald Reagan presidency. Okay, rolling the dice one more time. Maybe I'll just keep talking for like 3 hours. You think anyone would watch that video, just me refreshing this spreadsheet for 3 hours? Maybe they might. Okay. Loading. No dictatorships, 1 civil war, 2 expansions. Let's let it refresh for a second. There we go. Liberals, Republicans, Democrats. Pretty normal timeline. Again, the 3 parties clustered around the middle. Maybe in a future update, I'll change that. But I don't know how realistic that is compared to real life. Because America, of course, has 2 parties. Look at this. In the base timeline, it's a bunch of years. 50 years of Republicans. Another relaxing timeline. Odd timeline. Relaxing timeline. Look at this. An uncomfortable timeline because there's 6 expansions. Not even Mexico. What are the 6 then? Oh. Oh, look at that. So it's Texas, California, Canada, Cuba, and in this timeline there was a civil war where Virginia seceded, so West Virginia is a state. So we count that as an expansion. Look at this, the civil war is definitely over here. Look at that. A nice nice medium. Oh, 2 civil wars. They seceded over here too. Shout out to Louisiana. Shout out to Missouri and Florida and Texas. They didn't secede the first time, so they had to wait until the second round to secede. But then they all rejoined again so Hannibal Hamlin definitely crushed them and then re-annexed them into the country. And then they voted for the American Party. Ironic. And the Americans stay as a conservative party throughout this whole period. So we can see in 2024, they don't get any votes. I mean, they get 7.4% of the popular vote, but they don't get any electoral college votes. And they're an authoritarian right-wing party. So they would be the farthest southern states. Yeah, so we can see that they won these states in real life in 2064. And the liberals are moderate and the Democrats are progressive. Oh, look at that. Look at that. That's a beauty. Is it going to reload? I hope not. Oh. Well, there you have it. That's an excellent timeline to end the video on. Here we have all of American history. Not too crazy, not too crazy. Then there's 1850s, Civil War over slavery, world chaos over slavery. Then we have Horace Greeley, James Blaine, Benjamin Harrison, William McKinley, George Dewey. But then the Republicans pop up and they're radicals. So in 1912, Eugene V. Debs wins the presidency and nobody likes him. I'm sorry, Eugene V. Debs, but you're too radical. Even the states that voted for Eugene V. Debs seceded because it's divided by 0, which means every state seceded. Look at that. Oh my God. Okay. So after what election is this? Okay, well there's much more, but in the for the 1912 election, most states have seceded. Well, maybe not most, but a bunch of states. Wow, that's not good. Look at that, New Mexico and Arizona and these states over here seceded. So a bunch of states seceded for the 1912 election. President Eugene Chaffin did not. Was he a radical conservative? Let's see who he was. Eugene Chaffin, radical conservative. There you go. And who was he in real life? Eugene W. Chaffin. Prohibition Party. So I put the Prohibition Party as a radical right-wing party. So he wins. Basically, everybody secedes because he's too crazy in this timeline. He's too much. And then Eugene V. Debs wins the states that don't secede. And then every other state secedes afterwards. So sorry, Eugene V. Debs. It's like Eugene V. Debs alone in the White House and every other state's like, okay, bye. Damn. Interesting result that happened here. I don't know why this happens when everyone secedes. I think sometimes it's just based off random results. Did anybody stay in the country? No, look at that. Everything's divided by 0 because Eugene V. Debs destroys the country. Ay. Wow. Interestingly, the country's more conservative for the election. Look at that, 601 electoral college votes, all outside the actual country. Because look, it's Cuba, it's Mexico, Canada. No, not even Quebec joined though. Wow. Now, why did they do that? Why did everyone become so radical? Okay, so we have. This is in the late 1800s, so this is the populist era, right? So people are feuding over the control of businesses, that sort of thing. Then we have a civil war under Benjamin Harrison, maybe over economic issues. Civil war, well, chaos under William McKinley. Recession, chaos. So the country just plummets in the late 1800s over economic issues. Maybe they failed to resolve the issue of slavery. Maybe. That might be the case. Abraham Lincoln was president, though. But maybe the country failed to resolve the issue of slavery. They stayed together for a little bit, more stable over here, but then they just plummeted. That's too bad for America. Okay, well, I think that's a great note to end the video on. If you get this spreadsheet on patreon.com/whatwhyhow, you too could refresh it over and over again, trying to get more interesting timelines. Each one I think was pretty interesting because even the more relaxing ones, it's interesting to see how different parties might align, how there might be a conservative and a liberal and a moderate party, or they're all liberal and one's conservative. You too could get access to the spreadsheet at patreon.com/whatwhyhow. You could subscribe for only $1 a month and get early access to future videos, or I might have a purchase option. And in any case, thanks to those who already support me, who are on the screen now, and thanks, and if you've listened to this far, this long, an hour and whatever, So why not subscribe? Why not like? And again, check out patreon.com/whatwhyhow. Thank you and adios.